I'm here not to talk about an issue or a book, but I hopefully to tell you a little story. It is the story of my hometown. Recently, I grew up in Colorado Springs, um, right outside of Fort Carson, which is a very large Army base. Right now, it has around 32,000 active duty. When I was growing up in the 80s and had a lot of friends who were in military families there, getting deployed generally meant maybe spending a year or two in West Germany. And my friends would come back with superior knowledge of types of chocolate I had never heard of. It was not a bad gig. Um, and when I moved back to Colorado Springs when I was an adult, things were very different. I started working for my hometown newspaper, the Colorado Springs Gazette. And being deployed meant going to the Sunni Triangle or going to the Pesh River Valley, places that you stand a fairly good chance of dying every day. It's not something that I ever knew about or it was my job to know about at the newspaper. My job at the newspaper, I thought I had the sweetest gig in the world. They hired me, and there actually is a job for this in Colorado. They hired me as their ski writer. And in the summer, I did things like mountain biking and climbing mountains and things like that. But essentially, my job was to write about how to enjoy yourself in the Rocky Mountains and profile people who do it particularly well, which was great. And then these murders started. Fort Carson had one murder and then another. Strange murders. Murders that were strange, not in the way that they happened, but because when you looked for reason, there was very little reason for them to happen. And at the newspaper, we dutifully reported, as newspapers do, that these things would happen, and this is set up for trial in so many months, and then we would report on whether the person was guilty or not guilty, and they were always found guilty. But we weren't, as a newspaper, telling the story. What was the story? Why was this happening? And as a journalist, you could ask Fort Carson that, and they have a whole office of spokespeople who are ready to tell you without saying very much about, try to explain to you what's going on. And they would say, well, look, this is a big population, and soldiers are like anybody else. You're going to have some bad apples in there who are going to get in trouble. And that was their line for years. And so finally, I decided, well, who would really know about this? Well, the soldiers who were there would know about it. So since many of them are just sitting in prison, maybe they'd be willing to talk to me. I brought this idea up to my editor, and the editor said, Phillips, you're the ski writer. Essentially, go sit down. And so this is something that I started to do in my free time, contacting guys in prison, tracking them down, sitting down with them and talking sometimes for a whole afternoon, saying, okay, let's start in high school. Tell me when you joined up, and let's end in prison, and tell me what happened in between. And then I would ask them, who else was there with you? Who else could tell me about this same story? And started to just rebuild pieces of the platoon that had scattered over time, either guys who had gotten arrested or guys who'd gotten out of the Army and gone home, and tried to rebuild this story. Because I thought it was an important story both for my city and for the Army, and ultimately for all of us to learn what had happened with the soldiers at Fort Carson that had created a string of murders. And I'm not talking a couple murders. I'm talking about within this brigade. And I quickly learned after tracking down soldiers that it was one combat brigade that all this was happening in. Within this brigade, there was one particular battalion, and almost all of the crimes came out of that. That's about 500 soldiers. And if you calculated the murder rate, it wasn't one or two bad apples, it was a murder rate that was about 100 times the national average. And if you adjust it and you said, okay, look, it's all young men, they're all young, they're all male. That's the highest risk of violent crime of any section of the population. If you adjusted for that, it was still 20 times greater than that very high-risk group. So we're talking a big problem. So I started to piece together what had happened. And I'm going to read to you a little bit about it, and then I'm going to tell you what's happened since. Because as I made sure to say when I was at the Pentagon today, the Army repeatedly says it is a learning organization. And there's a number of individuals where that's really true. People that saw what was going on and said, Jesus, we've got to fix this. And that really had started to happen at Fort Carson, to the point where the things that I wrote about, which is sort of war experience and the failures of integration at their worst, those things have now turned around to where Fort Carson is looked at almost as a model. People from Big Army come now to Fort Carson and say, oh, wow, things are really working here. Let's find out what's working so that we can spread it Army-wide. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story of this brigade. I'm going to read for just a few minutes. Let me give you some background. All the guys that I am talking about, almost all of them are 19, 20 years old. All of them joined right out of high school and were all immediately sent to Korea, not Iraq. And they were expected to stay in Korea for a couple years, guarding the North Korean border. But this was back in 2003, early 2004, and all of a sudden, folks at the Pentagon realized that the Iraq War was not going very well, and they might need some extra troops in there. And so these guys were very suddenly called up from Korea and sent to the worst part of Iraq at the time. They were in what's called the Sunni Triangle, right between Ramadi and Fallujah. So I'm just going to tell you I have a few vocab words here that I had to learn a whole language when I was talking to these guys. One of them, the active duty folks who here will know. I refer to something called a SAW. This is not something you cut down trees with. It stands for Squad Automatic Weapon. It's essentially like a medium-sized machine gun that some of these soldiers carried. I'm also going to refer to something called Route Michigan. This is a 4-lane highway, just like an interstate, that connected Ramadi and Baghdad. And it was this battalion's job to essentially do highway patrol there. But highway patrol there was so full of firefights and burned out cars pushed to the side of the road that they quickly renamed it, my last vocab word. They called it Operation Mad Max, after the 80s movie. They named all their operations after old 80s movies. So I'm going to read to you a particularly bad day on Mad Max. And then afterwards, I'm going to just briefly explain how it kind of echoed throughout time. And excuse me for using some names that I haven't introduced you to the characters, but whenever you picture them, picture me, but 10 years ago. These are all very young, skinny guys. Their helmets look too big for them. So don't picture Rambo, because you won't have the right image in your head. I'm taking you back to 2004 in the Sunni Triangle. By the end of the week, when Kenny Eastridge learned his platoon was going back on 3 days of Mad Max, everyone was on edge. They had been trained early on to protect themselves from ambushes by watching for anything out of the ordinary. Problem was, they soon also learned that almost everything in their corner of Iraq was out of the ordinary. Every day, the soldiers struggled to find meaningful hints of what normal was in their patrol area and what normal was not. 3 people dressed head to toe in black robes, their faces covered except for glaring eyes. Was that normal? 7 men in headscarves packed into a tiny taxi. Was that normal? A burning mound of trash in the middle of the neighborhood, with goats foraging on the smoldering edges. Was that normal?